Good morning. My name is Stacy Willson, and I'm going to be talking about disability in academia and the barriers that go along with having a mental illness such as bipolar while in higher education or even as a professor, sorry about that, at a university. And there are a lot of stigmatizations that go along with having a mental illness. And so a lot of times people don't want to disclose that information, especially professors or adjunct professors, because they don't want that to interfere with their career becoming in tenure or getting into tenure and that sort of thing. And a lot of times, even though there's this American Disability Act that we have, it still is undermined and people still get stereotyped with having a mental disorder, even though it's pretty well known that a lot of people do have mental illness, because 1 in 5 people have mental illness according to the National Institute of Mental Health. So it's not an uncommon thing. And part of what I was going to talk about today is not just the professors, but the students who struggle with mental illness in higher education and the barriers that they face. Now, one of the things that you can do is a student, if you have bipolar, which actually I'm going to tell you what bipolar is right now so you understand what it is. It's characterized in the WHO as repeated at least 2 episodes in which the patient's mood and activity levels are significantly disturbed. This disturbance consisting on some occasions of an elevation of mood and increased energy and activity or hypomania, and others of lower mood and decreased activity or depression. When reading a couple of the books that I pulled from, one was called Mad at School, Rhetorics of Mental Disability in Academic Life by Margaret Price. She was actually a professor, and she goes through all these narratives of people who struggle with mental illness within the university setting and how they can be accommodated or get access. In fact, the accommodation word isn't a good word to use, according to Katie Guest-Pryl, who wrote Life of the Mind Interrupted, the book that we read, because she feels like accommodation, if you think about accommodation, it's like you're getting a hotel, people are accommodating you for these things, but if you can just have access to information or access to a different format that might help, then that can be something worth looking at. There is a critical model of disability that I want to mention, and part of that involves albiism. And albiism is actually societal's attitudes that devalue and disregard people with disabilities, also denoting an attitude that devalues or differentiates disability through the evaluation of able-bodiedness equal to normalcy. If bipolar students do not take pharmaceuticals, they may be stigmatized by their educational staff and peers. Now, that's something worth looking into, because so as a mentally disabled student, you're really struggling with school, because with bipolar, you have ups and downs. Sometimes you sleep too much or not enough, and so you're constantly trying to keep up. I myself have the illness, and so in my own experience, I went to the disability services through the University of Idaho, and I was able to talk with someone about my disability, and I was able to prove it because I have the paperwork, but she wanted my medical records. And I was like, no, I don't really want to disclose the medical records. It's bad enough that I had to tell you that I was on disability and why and that sort of thing, like to a complete stranger. And now you want my medical records. And so I thought to myself, no, I think I'm going to pass on this. But what they did say is that they can accommodate you through extension of assignments and things like that. And that was a deterrent for me as well, because I don't want to get behind, or I feel like I'll never catch up. So That was my experience. Now, in some of the narratives that I read with Life of the Mind Interrupted and Mad at School, sometimes it can take quite a while to get in to see disability services. Some people may not even know that there is a service for that, or that there is a help or a resource that can help them with that. And then once you do get an appointment, you have to show that you have a disability because they can't see it. You're not missing an arm. Those are other disabilities as well. But they can't see it, so you have to prove it. And so you have to schedule an appointment with a psychologist and get paperwork to prove that you have that disorder, and that can take a while. So in the meantime, there should be an alternative plan for somebody who is seeking help, and there usually isn't. It can take 6 weeks or longer to get those results back on what kind of mental illness you might have or what the recommendation would be. And with the critical model of disability, it situates the educational barrier in the institutional policies and structures, not the student body. And the critical social model is a theme in almost every book that I found. Little research has been published on student-specific needs for bipolar or socioeconomical barriers experienced by those with disabilities. Most students choose to leave their disability as a secret because of the stigma attached to mental disabilities, lack of training among faculty and staff, and it can deter them from being vulnerable with their disability, and they don't want to talk about it. And so that can be a real struggle for people who have mental illness and want to do better in school. And in fact, in 2011 to 2012, mental illnesses are so common in the United States that 1 in 5 live with mental illness. And then according to the Nation Survey of Campus Disability, 1 in 4 have it, and 86% of the students end up dropping out of school. And so if, for example, I was in a situation where I was getting really behind in school and I wasn't able to pull myself back up by my bootstraps, then there could be a possibility that I'd drop out of school or miss the deadline for dropping out of school. A lot of times they turn to substance abuse and things like that. And in Life of the Mind Interrupted, she, as a professor, experienced the same thing. If someone found out that she had the mental illness, she was immediately stigmatized by it. She struggled getting to classes on time to teach, and some days she could write a sentence or could not write a sentence at all in her mind. And then other times she had a lot of energy. That's what bipolar is. It's just this up and down, like they compare it to climbing the peaks of the Himalayas. And so there's also another concept, not only the Albius concept, but there's a concept called karyotic time. And that's what I'm going to get into is a karyotic space, which is a space that can be centered around people, more individualized for people who have mental illness. So karyotic space can be groups of people or big or small groups of people. Now, as a professor, karyotic space could be going to an academic conference and being in that environment. Going through hallways with people are grouping together and going to bars. And sometimes those spaces aren't really great for people with bipolar illness. It can cause panic attacks and things like that. And then there's the concept of the normative class, which means, okay, you go to class, show up on time, and you engage in the class, and that is going to equal productivity. And then with the professors, this is going to be a universal design for learning with them, because some just go in there, they teach, they do their lecture, and then they go home, grade the paper, and call it a day. And so part of this universal design for learning is to set an ideal for all styles of learning. And to be able to approach people of different backgrounds, all different backgrounds, and including and not limited to mental illness. And part of this is providing or navigating chaotic space. And rather than just disability access, perhaps approaching the class differently. She was talking about the role of presence, and in the normative rule of attendance. The class doesn't offer an independent study. There's no offerings of other types of learning that can be accommodated. It's rare for an instructor to offer information regarding chaotic space. There is a model she calls is called Courage to Teach, and the solution is to deepen and broaden the channels of access from the very beginning of class. What are your pet peeves? What alternative forms of communication would you prefer? And what are your own abilities and limitations in chaotic spaces? And so there are different formats that people can use to teach that might bypass those disability services altogether. There's an open line of communication or a one-on-one that they can do to just kind of say, hey, or be open with the professor about what's going on. Then the help might just be that. That might be the solution to the problem. You might want to, as a professor, experiment with multiple channels of feedback, not just, oh, I have an office hour from 1 to 2, I can do Zoom, but maybe some other options that, might be a little more safe for some people with bipolar disorder. There are different learning strategies that everybody has in the classroom, not just bipolar people. There's apparently 10 different intelligences, and not everybody can perform to that normative classroom style that I spoke about. And it can be quite frustrating when you can't make it to class because you couldn't sleep for a week, or you can't turn an assignment because you can't turn your brain on because you couldn't sleep for a week, or there are other things going on in your life that interrupted your focus with school. And there really shouldn't be any reason why bipolar people shouldn't be able to get into the higher education. I think there's a lot of stigmatism that goes along with that we're unpredictable, or that we might be violent and things like that. And it needs to be steered straight. If 1 in 5 people have this illness, then why can't the professors understand this a little bit more to accommodate a little bit better for people with disabilities? 86% of people dropping out is a pretty big amount. What I was saying earlier with the professors not being protected by the American Disabilities Act, there has been job restructuring that they do, and that means less classes for you to teach. A lot of times they get 2 instead of 4, a modified schedule, a longer tenure clock, things like that. Are they disabled enough? That can be a question sometimes. And a lot of people have sued the ADA, but a lot of people lose when they do that. It's really hard for people to win in that situation, where if a disability is disclosed and then they're judged and their job changes, or they lose their job as a result of it, it's hard to get protected. And they can come up with other reasons, like why you lost your job, sort of thing. Mindfulness would be a great way to say for professors to be aware of who their students are in the class. And that's one of the presence for students. It's an essential thing for professors. And it ideally, So ideally, what we'd like to do is get the disability services a little more accommodating to people that come there, and give information so that people even know that it's there. And then in the beginning of the class, if there can be a clear communication on an open-mindedness of how to approach each student, then that can definitely be a solution to solving this problem with disability and mental illness in academia, and so people can actually succeed. There should be no reason why they shouldn't be able to get a master's or a PhD or be able to become a professor because they have something wrong with their brain that they're actually taking medication for. And that's what Life in the Mind Interrupted was saying. She was saying that, you know, if you take a lot of medication, sometimes you can be really tired and it seems like you're not paying attention in class, but you're just really tired from the medication, you know, and there are things like that that pop up. And in all my other research, through all the other journal articles that I discovered, it talked a lot about stereotypes on people with bipolar disability, which is the belief that you're either abled or disabled. There's no in between. Disabled people are exempt from rules of appropriate and social interaction. They require pity or concern, like maybe they get a break from something because, you know, they're not having to do as much work as the next person. That because disability is an invisible illness, it is further marginalized. And I've seen it. I've gotten stereotyped with my own experience of telling people that I have it. But on a positive note, if a professor says they have it, then that can bring enlightenment to the department or wherever they're at to say, hey, you know what, maybe there's somebody else in here who has it. Maybe they'll stand up and say they have it too. And so through information and knowledge and conferences and mainly education, then this can be an experience that can be good for bipolar people. Academic experience can be a good experience for bipolar people and people with other mental disabilities that struggle. And so that's basically what I wanted to discuss. Some of the solutions of scholars of disability can remind us of the relevance of narrative genre, of giving a voice to speak against dominant perceptions of mental illness. Faculty can be shown that interactions pose serious problems with students with disabilities. And despite disability laws, colleges continue to ignore the needs of disabled students. And so, yeah, I just wanted to focus on the barriers of academia, and both with being a professor in the academic world and how we can change that, and hopefully in the future, these things being so common, 1 in 5 people with mental illness realize that this is a normal. This is not an abnormal thing. This is something to really take a look at, and especially if the department needs money, if you need money, help these people out, and they will give you your money. So anyway, thank you again. My name's Stacy Willson, and I appreciate you listening.